Nietzsche is not a nihilist. If you read his book, The Will to Power, you will discover that Nietzsche was actually very passionate, that he had a lot of commitments, and that he ultimately couldn't come to the conclusion of nihilism, which is essentially that there is no meaning. One of his most beautiful statements in relation to this, and one of his most beautiful refutation of nihilism and the rejection of values, is his claim that nihilism is basically a rejection and refutation and avoidance even of the real world. Basically, he says that it's a way of trying to make the world nothing. Nihilism is, but he goes on to say that that's pretty much impossible. This makes sense when you look at Nietzsche's philosophy because he was really about living in this world specifically. He was definitely about living in the moment, in our present time, and not getting carried away by illusions, fantasies, religion, and the like. He really cared about this life and what this life had to offer and confronting that life and all of its pains and contradictions with all of the suffering and all of the things that we don't understand, the mysteries and the like. I think that's a very powerful claim. I think it's a powerful claim, and it definitely gets me thinking in general about nihilism and how I may or may not apply it to my life. I don't see myself as a nihilist, but I definitely see myself as influenced by nihilism. Definitely not in its extreme form, because if I took it in its extreme form, I would basically have to say that I have no values and that I don't believe in anything. But that is definitely not true. Nonetheless, I think there's a way in which I have come to grips with reality as very harsh, as very confusing. And so it's not that I don't have values, it's just that my values are constantly under scrutiny because I know how unpredictable and contingent the world actually is. And this is an important point. A lot of people see nihilism as a kind of bleak view, as a hopeless worldview, and it can if you take it to its extreme. Just think of thinkers like Mitchell Heisman. But if you think about nihilism in perhaps, for example, an existentialist vein, what you're left with is this understanding that there's actually kind of hope with a minor or mild form of nihilism, which is essentially the idea that you get hope from the idea that you don't have to put too much emphasis on your values, you don't have to see them as the ultimate truth, and that leaves a lot of room for discovery, that leaves a lot of room for possibility, and that leaves a lot of room for exploration. This, of course, doesn't mean that you reject values, that you reject society's values. It just means that you scrutinize the values and you make the most out of the values that you do have. And the way that I see it, nihilism in this sense is a way of being honest. It's very interesting because when I think about the history of nihilism, I can't help but definitely be fascinated. I think of Dostoevsky's definition of nihilism, which is understood in his book Crime and Punishment, where he basically describes nihilism or a nihilist as a person who is above the law, so to speak. They're a person who essentially can make whatever decision they want for the greater good or for what is better for society, even if that means they do immoral things or terrible things or even crimes. This is how Raskolnikov was ultimately able to justify his murder, because he thought that he was a nihilist and he thought that he was doing the right thing, which is very interesting. It also originates from Turgenev's Fathers and Sons, where one of the one of the main characters is a nihilist, and it's really interesting how all of that plays out in that book. It's very interesting that nihilism is actually a very Russian tradition in a lot of ways, or at least the way that we talk about Russian literature and the way that we talk about nihilism. I'm bringing this up because nihilism has a lot of subtext that we don't take into account. So when we think about how Oscar Wilde was a nihilist in a sense because he rejected the values of bourgeoisie society, of conventional society, because he felt that they were essentially hypocritical, and Oscar Wilde was about living real, then really we go back to my original point about nihilism, which is that nihilism serves a function, that our values do not have to be our defining feature of everything that we do. And of course, this can be intimidating in a lot of ways, but it's also a way of scrutinizing the world in a very honest way. Nietzsche has an interesting critique of nihilism as well, because he says that the problem with nihilism is that it's a rejection of knowledge and a rejection of truth. But I don't think nihilism has to be taken that far as well. I think that some people do take nihilism that far, but as some people would say, if you take nihilism that far, you would ultimately have to realize that you can't justify your existence and would therefore have to terminate your life, which is a conclusion that I don't agree with for many, many different reasons that I won't go into now. But the point is, I think that you can still have values and truth and still be a nihilist. Now, of course, I'm not talking about these things because I need to convey that I'm a nihilist and that I need to convince you of being a nihilist, but I think that nihilism is really interesting with how we talk about it because, or how it's very interesting that it exists, and it's interesting that it came into being. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, that it has a specific function. So essentially, as one of my friends said in a brilliant argument, nihilism is essentially a worldview. It is essentially a worldview that comes from a specific mood and that comes from a specific mindset. And more specifically, he says it comes from a depressive mindset. And I think if you're going to synthesize everything that I've been saying, what you're left with is this idea that nihilism really, really attempts to be real. It really attempts to confront and engage reality in a lot of different ways. Of course, Nietzsche contradicts that with his earlier statement that I mentioned before, which is that nihilism is a rejection of the world. But I don't think that that necessarily has to be the case, because nihilism has different facets to it. If you take nihilism too far, then yes, basically you're acknowledging in a very backwards kind of way that the world doesn't exist, which doesn't make sense and which you can't do. But what I'm fascinated by is definitely the history of nihilism, is definitely this argument by my friend about nihilism, definitely the way in which we use nihilism, even in its more subtle forms, and the kind of power that that brings. And I hope that you enjoyed this talk. This is Phoenix, and thank you.